So here's a fairly common and fun scenario to discuss and perhaps learn from. It's the beginning of the 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte is cleaving his way through Europe. Warfare is now gunpowder based with muskets and artillery. You have tens of thousands of soldiers tightly packed, as dense as possible, wearing no armor, using slow, muzzle-loading muskets. If you were the Duke of Wellington, wouldn't you think, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have a regiment of archers? After all, armor largely nullified archery. Gunpowder nullified armor. And now, since no one's wearing armor, wouldn't archery complete this rock, paper, scissors triangle? This would have been an unimaginably perfect scenario for a medieval archer. So why didn't Wellington, Napoleon, or any other nation at this time equip their armies with bows? Why didn't they deploy archers? Reason number one, there weren't any. In discussing history, we sometimes become confused over the time frame of when certain things happened compared to each other. The Napoleonic era was the 1800s. The 100 Years' War, which is regarded as the peak of archery in Europe in medieval times, especially English archery, ended in 1453, and the battles of Crécy and Agincourt were during the 1410s, 1420s. The final documented use of English longbows in battle was during the English Civil War in 1642, and in which case it actually was effective against unarmoured musketmen. Effectively, though, between 1642 and the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s, that's nearly 200 years since the bow was last used as a weapon in the army. And if you consider the peak of war archery in the medieval times, that's nearly 400 years. Archery at this point in history was a sporting pursuit, not a weapon of war. I mean, this is where we see the typical archer being a lady wearing a very large dress, not the armor-clad medieval warriors of the past. So, given that there have been several generations since the last use of bows in combat, it's not an exaggeration to say that there are literally no more archers. Even if Wellington wanted to have a company or a regiment of archers in his army, he couldn't raise one. Now, the solution for having a shortage of troops is, of course, to train more troops. So why couldn't you just train more archers? Well, this leads to reason number two. You couldn't train more archers. At least not in the time frame that was required of warfare at this time. Remember, archery is a lifetime pursuit. To be an effective archer, to be strong enough to use a heavy warbow, to be confident enough and consistent enough to shoot accurately, to learn to fight in formations in the army, you would have to have years upon years of constant training. That is how the armies that use archers successfully dominated. The Mongols, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Persians, the English. This was a lifetime career as an archer. Now, the English succeeded in this through the mandatory practice of archery by law. This was achieved through the Assize of Arms in 1252, which mandated that every person in England was required to own and practice with a bow. The reason why English archers were so successful during the medieval times and were so well regarded wasn't because of the bow itself or even the user of the bow. It was because England had a partly militarized civilian population. When you force every single person to become adept at archery, it's basically the equivalent of mandatory service in today's countries where some nations have conscription. You might serve a couple of years in the army, then be put in the reserve. So if you need to go to war, you can call up an already trained civilian population to fight in the armed services. And the advantage here, of course, is that if you had to call up an army, you can call in your reserves, your militia, your conscripts, without having to train them from scratch. And that's the same as what happened in medieval England. If the king wanted to go to invade France and needed thousands of archers, he could get thousands of archers immediately. In fact, the king and many nobles already had a standing body of semi-professional archers. So all they had to do was to supplement the corps of archers with additional already trained levies. You can't do that in the 1800s because such a standing force of trained militia didn't exist. The population no longer practiced archery. So you couldn't get thousands of archers from the general population because there weren't thousands of archers in the general population. That the art and the skill of using a bow and arrow in war was actually lost. Like, people literally didn't know how to use a bow and arrow anymore. Remember, this is the industrial age, hundreds of years since the peak of archery in medieval warfare. You're not going to find an archery master meditating under a waterfall or hiding in Sherwood Forest. The art was gone, the skill was gone, the craft was gone. And on a side note, the reinvention and popularization of traditional archery is a modern thing. It was only after the industrial period where people were interested in doing more historical archery. In contrast, while you couldn't call up and train an army of archers within months, you could do that for muskets, and that's exactly what they did. The third reason is logistics, and this is something which is often overlooked when discussing warfare. We tend to only judge the effectiveness of weapons in isolation, but not thinking about the big picture. Now, we said before that England's success during the medieval times and the reputation of the archers wasn't just because of the bow or the archers, it's because of the mass training of the population. But alongside this is basically what we call the military-industrial complex. You have a country which legislates mandatory archery practice, but also has an economy that is driven by this demand for archery. In order to meet this military archery demand, you needed to have the logistics in place on a massive scale. You needed the producers, the bowyers, the fletchers, all the craftspeople and artisans to produce. You needed to feed them with the right materials. That means importing them from other countries. You needed wood from Spain or Italy to produce the best longbows. You needed arrows to be made or imported. Merchants had to be taxed or given a levy, so they had to pay for or provide arrows in order to trade in England. This was an entire economy that fed the military-industrial complex of medieval England. This complex did not exist in the 1800s. The skill and expertise to create bows and arrows was nearly non-existent, and you certainly could not produce enough bows and arrows on that scale by the beginning of the 19th century. And in terms of scale, remember that at the Battle of Agincourt alone, it's been said that it required up to 500,000 arrows to supply their archers. That's one battle. How will a nation that has stopped producing bows and arrows for military purposes suddenly make millions of arrows for a campaign on the continent? Even though a musket is a more complicated piece of equipment, the tools, machining, and expertise allowed it to produce on a much larger scale, whereas the creation of bows at the time would have been done by hand, And again, how can you mass produce tens of thousands of bows in a short time period without the tools and the skills to do so? We can barely do so today. I mean, our bows are mostly manufactured in factories, and we have a fairly low supply. So to do this on a nationwide scale in the 1800s would have been unimaginable. Again, it was far easier to produce lead shot en masse than it was to create an arrow. Even if it was possible to produce all this on the scale that was required for war on the continent, it still wouldn't make any logistical sense. How will you physically supply soldiers? How will you carry these millions of arrows into the battlefield? A soldier alone can carry more musket balls or cartridges than an archer could carry arrows. An army can simply bring massive amounts of cartridges in their supply trains. Why would you complicate the supply chain by adding millions of arrows on top of that? And even if all this was feasible, we go to our number 4 reason. It wouldn't work anyway. Even if we had all the pieces, if we somehow had companies of archers at the beginning of the 1800s, if we had somehow could supply all of them with quality warbows and enough ammunition to last for the entire campaign, and we could deploy them on the battlefield alongside muskets, they still wouldn't be effective. On paper, yes, archers might have an advantage. Sure, they might shoot faster, they could shoot over terrain, they could shoot over other formations, they might have a higher effective range, they might inflict more casualties on unarmored targets, but that is only a theoretical assumption. In practice, none of these advantages would play out. For starters, historically, archers might have fulfilled the role of what we now call artillery by harassing and depleting enemy units at range. By Napoleon's era, we literally have artillery. So instead of archers acting as skirmishers opening the battle, we have cannons opening the battle at much greater distances. What advantage the archer might have at range would quickly dissipate as the battlefield became filled with smoke from the black powder weapons. You couldn't see the enemy at long distance, and part of the reason why you had to close at closer distances, and as they say, shoot when you see the white of their eyes, was because you couldn't see the enemy through the thick of battle. So archers who could leisurely fling arrows on a perfectly sunny day probably would not see that in a Napoleonic battle. In the end, in terms of dealing damage or casualties, muskets were far more deadly. Arrows actually weren't that effective at killing troops. Wounding, yes. Demoralizing, yes, but killing, not necessarily. In fact, the casualties in a medieval battle were relatively low. Most people fled the battle rather than were killed in battle, and normally the casualties were quite lopsided. The winning side would rout the losing side and then slaughter them during the rout. You wouldn't really see the same number of casualties as you would see in the Napoleonic Wars. During Napoleon's time, given the deadliness of muskets and artillery, both sides in a battle would suffer thousands, if not tens of thousands of wounded and dead. And that was with muskets and cannons alone. Maybe the occasional bayonet charge or cavalry saber, but you could inflict far, far greater damage with a musket-armed army. You didn't need archers to supplement this. If anything, having archers would mean that you're taking resources away from your effective weapon. I mean, this was a darker, grittier, destructive age of warfare. War was no longer romantic. This is the era where we see the real tragedies of war. In the past, it might have been idyllic to go out to battle and earn some glory, but in modern warfare, in Napoleon's time, it was basically standing to get shot by artillery or by random musket ball. There was no honor or glamour or romance. And when we see the epics like the Charge of the Light Brigade, we no longer see that beauty of war, but more the futility and the suffering of the soldiers who fought in them. In summary, this idea of archers being effective against Napoleonic era armies is only a theoretical matchup. And again, on paper, archers will have an advantage in rate of fire and effective range and other things. But it's a bygone era. The archers were basically ancient history to the Napoleonic soldiers. And this simply would not turn out the way you think it would. The musket armies would have been better trained, better drilled, and more effective on the battlefield than a medieval archer. There's a reason why nearly every nation that used bows adopted guns as soon as they became available. Anyway, that was my evaluation. What do you think? This is NUSensei. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.